It was just after 6 in the morning when her shrill, furious voice shattered my daily coffee ritual. I nearly dropped my mug right then and there. Through my front window, I spotted the HOA president, their perfectly styled blonde hair whipping around in the wind standing next to the brand new gate I'd installed at my ranch entrance 2 days prior. She was shouting at the top of her lungs, so loud that even my horses shifted uneasily in the corral. My first thought was that some sort of tragedy had taken place, but I soon realized the real emergency in her mind was that my gate didn't meet her bizarre color standards. I remember my heart pumping hard, half from shock, half from pure annoyance. Who in the world storms someone's property at daybreak over a paint job? I stepped outside, still in my old jeans and boots, and found her flanked by 2 HOA board members who looked more like reluctant hostages than her loyal assistants. They each clutched thick folders, which I later learned contained every twisted regulation she was prepared to hurl at me. Her name was Heather McGill. Everyone simply referred to her as Mrs. McGill because she demanded that level of respect. A perfectly pressed blouse, a pair of shiny pumps, and that trademark scowl were all part of her daily uniform. From the second I approached, she started waving an official-looking citation in my face, telling me that my new gate was an egregious violation of the HOA's color scheme policy. I hardly knew how to respond. I'd purchased this ranch from my father's side of the family, who had owned it for decades, and we were never under any illusions that an HOA could dictate everything about what we did. The official boundary line just happened to meet the new suburban neighborhood's property lines. She wanted uniform fences, beige paint, and carefully trimmed greenery across all the homes in the adjacent development. That might have been fine for typical suburban houses with postage stamp lawns, but this was a working ranch. It needed a real entrance gate that both symbolized our heritage and kept livestock from wandering off. Our old gate had collapsed in a storm, so I replaced it with a sturdy oak design painted a rustic deep red. Apparently, that triggered the meltdown of the century. Before I could utter a single greeting, she barked, "Do you have any idea how many complaints we've received about that unsightly color? 33 to be exact. This must be repainted within 72 hours or else." Her eyes blazed as though she were dealing with a hardened criminal. Meanwhile, I glanced down at her fancy citation, noticing a series of code numbers that looked questionable. I asked politely if she could show me the specific regulation in the official charter that forbade red gates. She gave a dismissive snort, flipping through her folder, then snapped, "Article 4, Section 7, Clause B.3. That's all you need to know, young man." I bit my tongue to avoid retorting with something uncivil. I didn't want to escalate the situation further. The 2 board members behind her exchanged glances, as though they themselves weren't sure if such a regulation existed. I'd heard stories from other residents about her forging new amendments, then presenting them as though they'd been passed by unanimous vote. However, I wasn't about to accuse her outright without evidence. I reminded her that my property predated the HOA by decades. From my understanding, we were grandfathered in unless I was missing some crucial detail. She fumed, shaking her citation in the air with renewed vigor, then declared that my ranch was within the purview of her authority, no matter its history. At that point, I got the distinct feeling she wasn't just spouting random rules, she was out for personal control. Neighbors had warned me about how she'd slapped monstrous fines on families for minor infractions, from the shape of their front door wreaths to the hue of their mailboxes. Still, I never expected her to appear, uninvited and enraged, at 6 a.m. to throw a fit over a gate. I calmly stated that I had no intention of repainting the entrance, and if she felt so strongly, she was welcome to try legal channels. That enraged her further. The mention of legal recourse made her lips press so tightly they went white. After that little showdown, she gave me a final glare that could have melted steel, declared war under her breath, and stormed off toward her spotless SUV. She threatened to report every single aspect of my ranching operation, livestock, feed storage, tractor equipment to all relevant agencies to ensure compliance with community standards. I stood there blinking in the early sunshine, astonished by how petty she seemed, but also unsettled by her determination to punish me. The 2 board members awkwardly shuffled behind her, avoiding eye contact as they got into the vehicle. At that moment, a subtle dread seeped into my gut. My rational mind told me she had no real power over my farmland, but the intensity of her fury felt like a storm was brewing. Within 48 hours, my mailbox was stuffed with notices, each from the HOA detailing new alleged violations. One complained that my corral fence was the wrong type of wood, and that it disrupted the neighborhood aesthetic. Another said my tractor was too old-fashioned and should be replaced with one that met neutral color standards. Then there was a truly mind-boggling statement claiming my chickens were producing noise pollution at unacceptable decibel levels. All told, these notices tallied potential fines exceeding $2,000, and she was just getting warmed up. My frustration boiled, but part of me also found it darkly comical that she tried to regulate the call of a rooster at dawn. I made it a point to read every line carefully. Half the codes she cited didn't even resemble actual HOA language. Some of them were typed in different fonts, as though she pieced them together from random documents. Yet, I knew she was cunning enough to spin these into official threats that might intimidate certain folks who didn't know better. So, I started investigating. I went online and downloaded the legitimate HOA charter from the county registrar's site. Sure enough, none of the rules she quoted were in it. I decided to keep my findings close to my chest, let her think she was winning while I lined up the facts. Meanwhile, I learned I wasn't her only target. My immediate neighbor, Kim Spencer, had a bright turquoise flower planter that Mrs. McGill called offensive and garish. Another neighbor had installed solar panels on their roof. She fined them heavily for violating aesthetic uniformity. The more I dug, the more I realized that she had singled out every household that didn't blend into her beige, meticulously manicured vision of the ideal community. A small coalition of frustrated residents began forming. We texted each other regularly, sharing the outlandish claims she'd made against us. One evening, I returned home to find my mailbox wide open, and another bright pink citation stuffed inside. It read, "Your new gate color is not an approved neutral tone. Failure to remove or repaint will result in further action. Final warning." I was about to tear it up when I heard a voice call my name from the shadows. I nearly jumped out of my skin. It was Frank, a longtime local who lived around the bend, holding a flashlight under his chin and darting quick glances left and right. He handed me an envelope, whispering that he had dirt on Mrs. McGill's real plans. Then he scurried off into the night, looking over his shoulder like a character in a spy movie. Inside the envelope was a single piece of paper with notes scrawled in shaky handwriting. It referenced an upcoming development project for high-end resort homes that would expand over farmland if the current landowners could be pushed out or forced to sell cheap. The note suggested Mrs. McGill was in contact with a real estate firm, presumably feeding them property data. My name was circled in red, with a cryptic comment: key property, force compliance, or levy unstoppable Feinstein acquisition. My chest felt tight. The gate fiasco might just be the tip of a much larger scheme. 3 days later, we had our first big neighborhood meeting in an old barn on the far side of the subdivision. About a dozen people showed up, representing households that had all felt the sting of Mrs. McGill's relentless citations. Some had been intimidated into paying partial fines, others refused to pay, and were now getting letters threatening legal action. One woman was nearly in tears because she feared losing her home over a ballooning list of minor alleged violations. I shared the official charter I'd downloaded, pointing out that she was inventing rules out of thin air. We all agreed to confront her at the next monthly HOA board session, but we needed more conclusive proof that she was operating beyond her legitimate scope. Kim Spencer, a skilled paralegal, volunteered to investigate the real estate angle. If she could find documents linking Mrs. McGill to that development firm, it might reveal a motive. I started preparing my own evidence folder, full of pictures of my property lines, pictures of the gate, and copies of the nonsense citations. We planned to present everything publicly so the entire board could see what she was doing, in the hope that a fair majority would realize they were backing a tyrant. As the date of the HOA meeting approached, the harassment intensified. Every morning at sunrise, Mrs. McGill or one of her cronies parked out front, measuring my grass or snapping photos of the tractor. It was clear they were hunting for anything that could be twisted into a rule violation. Oddly enough, it was always the same short woman with hair dyed a pastel pink, carrying a notepad. She'd scuttle around the perimeter of the property line, scribble something, and then vanish. I'd greet her politely, but she'd stare straight ahead like she was terrified to speak. Once, I joked, "You won't find anything illegal about my coffee mug's color, will you?" She didn't even crack a smile. By the time the day of the HOA meeting arrived, I was half expecting my gate to be forcibly removed by some clandestine operation in the night. Fortunately, It was still there, bold red, an emblem of defiance against her tyranny. The meeting was scheduled for 7 in the evening, and I got there around 6:30 to set up my laptop for a short presentation. I wanted to show the real regulations on a projector and compare them with the forged citations. Maybe a few folks would remain loyal to her, but I believed most people were fed up. A large crowd turned up, bigger than I'd ever seen at a standard HOA event. It wasn't just homeowners from the new development. Some older residents from the farmland outskirts also came. Mrs. McGill was seated at the head table, reading from a script. She had the confident posture of a person who believed she was untouchable. The second the session began, she recited a list of violations from around the neighborhood, imposing fines with the smooth efficiency of a grocery clerk scanning items. Solar panels, $500. Flower planters, $200. Ornamental mailbox flags, $300. It was almost surreal watching her reel off numbers without blinking. When she finally got to my ranch gate, she announced, "A red gate that offends multiple neighbors and fails to conform to the standard color palette. Fine, $1,000, plus a daily additional penalty if not repainted by the close of the week." The hush that fell was laced with tension. People had been waiting for this moment. I stood, cleared my throat, and asked if I could address the board. She stared daggers at me, but everyone in the room was already turning in their chairs, eager to hear my response. I introduced myself briefly, explained that my property predated the HOA's formation by decades, reminded everyone that the color scheme rules in the official charter applied exclusively to the new development homes. Her face turned stony, and she started flipping through her binder, presumably searching for some clause to contradict me. That's when I pulled up the official charter text on the projector. In front of every attendee, I scrolled through the relevant sections, pointing out the actual language. Nowhere did it prohibit a color such as red for a ranch fence or gate. I turned to ask if she could show me her source. She froze, lips parted, but no words came out. A murmur spread across the room. Some folks began whispering among themselves. Then Kim Spencer stood up and announced that she'd discovered documents linking Mrs. McGill to a real estate enterprise keen on expanding into farmland areas. She handed a stack of photocopies to 2 other board members, who started flipping through them, wide-eyed. The rumor swirling in my head was now laid out in black and white, a plan to force older ranchers into so many fines that they'd have no choice but to sell, enabling the development firm to scoop up properties at bargain prices. Things started moving fast. The board members demanded an explanation from Mrs. McGill, who sputtered denials, claiming she didn't recognize those documents. Then multiple neighbors raised their hands, sharing stories of how she told them it was in their best interests to move elsewhere. At this point, the atmosphere in the room felt electric. You could sense a tide turning. People who had been silent about her antics started voicing their anger, and the entire meeting descended into a flurry of accusations and defenses. Suddenly, she slammed her gavel and announced the meeting was adjourned. The rest of the board protested, but she stomped out, fuming. A small gaggle of loyal supporters trailed after her, but many onlookers stayed behind, discussing the possibility of removing her from the presidency altogether. I exchanged a few words with residents who asked if I'd press charges for harassment. I said I'd consider it if she escalated. An hour later, I was back at my ranch. Night had fallen, and the only sound was a soft breeze rustling across the pastures. I fed my horses, turned off the barn lights, and settled in on my front porch to gather my thoughts. There was a sense of relief that so many people had seen through her schemes, but also a lingering worry that she would retaliate. My phone buzzed a message from an unknown number that read, "Watch your back, she's not done with you." An uneasy feeling crept up my spine. I watched the dark road at the edge of my property for any suspicious activity, but nothing seemed out of place. Over the next few days, the tension simmered. Multiple neighbors told me they'd received late-night calls from blocked numbers, threatening more fines if they continued to support me. Kim mentioned that people were also finding typed letters on their doorsteps, warning them about colluding with a defiant rancher. A group of us joked that we needed to form our own anti-HOA watch committee, but the humor was a thin veil over genuine worry. One morning, as I was hitching my horse trailer, a sleek black sedan rolled onto my property. A sharply dressed man stepped out, introduced himself as an associate from that real estate firm. He offered me an unprompted opportunity to sell the land for a generous sum, encouraging me to Avoid all these messy conflicts. Something about his tone reeked of subtle intimidation. I declined. He insisted I think it over, reminding me that the gates of progress can't be stopped, then drove off without another word. My stubborn streak kicked into high gear. This ranch had been in my family for a long time. I wasn't about to let bullies push me off it. That evening, I returned from delivering hay bales to a friend's farm and saw headlights beaming near the entrance. As I drew closer, I recognized the figure pacing around, Mrs. McGill. My hands tightened on the steering wheel. She seemed to be yelling into her phone. When she saw my truck approaching, she quickly ended the call, jumped into her SUV, and sped off, fishtailing gravel as she left. Once again, dread took hold, because she wouldn't be prowling around at night unless she was plotting something extreme. The very next day, I got a frantic call from Kim. She said, "Your name's all over the new HOA newsletter, and she's claiming you're in violation of multiple local codes beyond the HOA's authority. She's contacted county zoning and the health department." I felt my gut twist. Sure enough, a county inspector showed up that afternoon, following an anonymous tip about hazardous conditions on my property. The inspector took one look around, checked my properly stored feed, examined the livestock area, and rolled his eyes. "I've been here 5 minutes, there's nothing to see. This is a perfectly normal ranch," he said, sighing. "I guess some folks just like to call in false reports." He closed his clipboard and thanked me for my cooperation, but I was still annoyed at the disruption. She was turning up the heat, probably rattled that I'd exposed her forging rules. I knew if she was brazen enough to contact county officials with false claims, she wouldn't hesitate to do worse. The question was, how far would she go? The next HOA board meeting was only a week away. Word got out that several residents intended to file a formal motion to remove Mrs. McGill as president for abusing her power and forging documents. Meanwhile, rumors flew about her ties to that shady real estate expansion plan. People who once dismissed these rumors started to realize there was actual evidence. Tensions were sky high. Early one morning, this was around 5 a.m. I woke to the unmistakable rumble of an engine out near the ranch gate. I hurried outside, phone in hand, ready to call 911. My gate, that sturdy oak structure I'd painted red, was lying half-crushed on the ground. A heavy piece of construction equipment, presumably stolen or rented under false pretenses, was backing away from the debris. Standing next to it, wearing a triumphant grin, was Mrs. McGill herself. My heart pounded. This wasn't just a petty act. She was committing outright vandalism, destroying a key part of my property that I'd spent thousands to install. She screamed at me, "You think you can defy the HOA? You think you can humiliate me with your phony claims of forged documents? This is what happens when you cross the line." Then she noticed I was filming. Her face twisted in panic for a split second, but rage quickly took over again. She waved at the driver of the equipment, a jittery man who looked frightened by her mania, urging him to continue the job. He hesitated, apparently unsure if he wanted any part of a criminal act. In that hesitation, I seized the moment. I sprinted to the barn, yanking the door open to reveal my old but powerful tractor. This tractor was a relic passed down from my grandfather. It was no shiny modern machine. It was battered green steel with a front-loader bucket that could still do some heavy lifting. I fired it up. The engine roared to life with a thunderous growl that reverberated across the property. When I drove it out, headlights illuminating the dust swirling in the air, Mrs. McGill froze in place. For a second, she looked like a deer caught in a set of very bright headlights. Her plan to flatten my gate turned into a standoff as I maneuvered the tractor between the gate wreckage and the construction equipment, effectively blocking them from causing further damage. Her fury skyrocketed. She hopped into her shiny white SUV, revved the engine, and roared forward, trying to get around me. It was a bizarre scene in the faint pre-dawn light. Me in the tractor, her in the SUV, both of us in a tense standoff. I motioned for her to stop and told her she was trespassing on private land. Instead, she jerked her steering wheel, ramming the SUV's fender against the corner of my gate's shredded remains. I heard the scrape of metal on wood, but she still wouldn't back off. When I realized she was intent on intimidation, adrenaline surged through my veins. She lurched the SUV forward again, tires spinning in the dirt, more shards of the gate cracking underneath the wheels. I shouted at the top of my lungs that she needed to clear out immediately, or I'd call 911. She sneered, rolling down her window to hurl an insult, but the engine drowned out her exact words. My phone in one hand, I decided enough was enough. I flicked the tractor into gear, lowered the loader bucket, and started inching toward the front end of her SUV. The screech of metal against metal was ear-splitting, but I kept going. She screamed, "You wouldn't dare!" But that sentence was cut off by a terrifying crunch as the tractor's steel bucket overpowered her hood. The entire front of the SUV began folding like an aluminum can, headlights bursting in a flash of sparks. She tried reversing, but it was too late. The tractor had pinned her vehicle at an angle. Her door flew open, and she leaped out, stumbling onto the ground in her perfectly pressed pantsuit, eyes wild with disbelief. I halted the tractor after a few more feet of inexorable push, leaving the SUV's engine compartment in a mangled wreck. She collapsed onto her knees, wailing at the sight of her precious luxury car half flattened. Her voice was raw, with unhinged rage and shock, shrieking about lawsuits, arrests, and personal vendettas. My hands shook on the tractor's steering wheel. The moment was intense, more than anything I'd ever experienced. The driver of the construction equipment had turned his machine off and was quietly trying to distance himself from the chaos. Neighbors, roused by the commotion, were rushing over in their pajamas. Several of them whipped out phones and started recording. I jumped down from the tractor, heart hammering, still holding my phone. She was screaming, "You're finished. You're going to jail. I'll make sure you lose everything." That's when I calmly reminded her that she'd entered my property without permission, had already caused thousands in damage to my gate, and refused to leave after repeated warnings. The entire sequence was recorded on multiple devices. She reached for her own phone, shaking violently as she tried to dial 911. But by now, a couple of neighbors had already called the authorities. Within minutes, a county sheriff's cruiser pulled up, sirens off but lights flashing. 2 deputies stepped out, surveyed the bizarre scene of a destroyed gate, a crushed SUV, and me still standing near my old tractor. Mrs. McGill launched into a hysterical tirade, blaming me for everything. The deputies asked to see the footage that had been recorded. Several onlookers stepped forward to show them the videos and explained that she'd been vandalizing my gate when I used the tractor to block her path. It didn't take long for the deputies to piece the puzzle together. One of them questioned the construction equipment operator, who admitted Mrs. McGill hired him to demolish a structure on the property that was non-compliant with HOA rules, never mentioning it was private property or that she lacked any legal claim. Another deputy led Mrs. McGill aside, but her shouting could still be heard. "He's dangerous. He attacked my car with that monstrous machine. He tried to kill me." "Oh." The deputy patiently explained that the video evidence showed her ramming the gate remains and ignoring commands to leave. She wasn't interested in calm reasoning. By now, she'd lost all semblance of composure, tears mixing with furious demands for my arrest. Finally, after reviewing the collective footage, the deputies concluded that she was the aggressor. She'd be charged with trespassing, vandalism, property damage, and possibly more depending on the outcome of the investigation. The sight of the handcuffs snapping around her wrists brought a wave of relief. She shrieked, jabbing her finger at me in a final threat. The moment the cruiser drove away with her in the back seat, neighbors flocked around me, still in shock at what they'd witnessed. Some looked worried I might also face trouble, but the deputies had already assured me that the evidence was on my side. Standing among the shattered remains of my once proud gate, I gazed at the battered front half of her SUV and felt a sense of surreal disbelief. I'd never wanted it to escalate like this, but she had forced my hand, leaving me no choice but to defend my property. A couple days later, a special emergency HOA board session was convened, without Mrs. McGill, obviously, to address the fiasco. Word traveled fast. The story was all over local social media. Residents shared their excitement that her reign of intimidation might finally be over. Some board members gave statements apologizing for letting her get so far out of control. At that session, they voted unanimously to remove her from the presidency, nullifying her bogus fines. They also issued a formal condemnation of her actions, adding that they would cooperate fully with any criminal investigation. I stood up at that gathering and, in a calm but firm tone, told them I wasn't seeking revenge. All I'd ever wanted was to be left in peace to run my ranch. Yet, her obsession with uniformity and power had spilled into outright lawlessness. I reminded them that many of the rules in the official charter were fine for neat suburban streets, But farmland and ranching operations had existed here long before the HOA was an idea on paper. Several older residents nodded in agreement. The conversation turned more constructive, with everyone agreeing to revise the bylaws so that no future president could weaponize them. Meanwhile, Mrs. McGill faced legal charges for her property destruction spree. On top of that, the revelations of her dealings with the real estate firm came to light, prompting further investigations. Rumor had it that some high-profile attorneys were involved on both sides, but the consensus among neighbors was that she'd bitten off more than she could chew. There were calls from certain residents to sue her personally for damages, though I decided to let the legal system do its work without piling on more lawsuits. With her SUV totaled, with her name disgraced, and with possible jail time looming, she vanished from public view. Occasionally, I'd catch a glimpse of rumors claiming she'd moved to a different county or was staying with relatives while awaiting her court date. My ranch, however, was free to remain as I intended, rustic and proudly sporting that red color. I was determined to rebuild the gate bigger, stronger, and redder than ever, if only as a testament to standing up against intimidation. Neighbors pitched in to help me clean up the debris. One local carpenter offered to craft a new gate at cost, and another friend arranged for discounted lumber. The sense of community that Mrs. McGill had tried so hard to fracture actually grew stronger, with people dropping by to offer moral support or bring refreshments for the volunteers. When the last plank was hammered into place, and I stepped back to admire the new, shining red gate, a wave of gratitude washed over me. This was no longer just a gate. It was a communal symbol of defiance against abuse of power. In the weeks that followed, the county's official charges against Mrs. McGill were formally announced: trespassing, malicious mischief, destruction of property, and a host of minor violations. Her attorney argued that she believed she had authority as HOA president to remove non-compliant structures, but the evidence was overwhelmingly against her. The court proceedings drew local media attention, with headlines like HOA president's SUV flattened by rancher's tractor in gate dispute, spreading rapidly. If her goal had been to maintain a respectable public image, it all backfired spectacularly. Eventually, she pleaded no contest, resulting in probation and mandatory community service. Rumor had it that part of her agreement was to resign from any and all HOA positions permanently. Whether that was true or just neighborhood gossip, the net result was the same. She'd never wield that power again in our community. Even the real estate firm she was conspiring with faced scrutiny for possibly encouraging her misconduct, though that investigation was still ongoing. Life at the ranch slowly returned to normal. The early morning crows of my roosters no longer triggered surprise inspector visits. The neighbors who remained in the development seemed genuinely relieved that her iron grip had dissolved, letting them breathe easier about harmless decor and landscaping choices. A few longtime residents I'd barely known started dropping in, telling me they'd always admired the ranch. Some asked to buy fresh eggs, while others simply wanted to chat about local history. One of the best conversations I had was with an elderly widow who recounted how her late husband had taught her to ride horses on our very fields decades ago, back when my father was running the place. Despite the chaos, I felt a newfound sense of belonging. Before all this, I'd tended to keep to myself, focusing on ranch work. Now, after so many neighbors united against a common foe, we'd built deeper connections. The new gate, with a carved wooden sign above it reading King Ranch Est, 1960, became a sort of local landmark. People driving by would slow down, nodding in approval as they caught sight of the bright red paint that defied the old boring uniformity Mrs. McGill had tried to enforce. Sometimes, standing on the porch at dusk, I found myself thinking about how quickly a situation can spiral if someone's thirst for control goes unchecked. Mrs. McGill may have started with good intentions once, perhaps wanting to keep the neighborhood tidy, but over time, something curdled into obsession. Her meltdown had been almost inevitable after so many years of absolute rule. Still, I took no pleasure in the fact that her life had essentially collapsed. The damage was of her own making, and the community was safer now that she could no longer wield her misguided authority. One Saturday, we organized a small community barbecue near the entrance to my ranch to celebrate a new spirit of cooperation. Folks brought potluck dishes, kids played tag among the hay bales, and a few families set up chairs by my new gate to take photos. Kim Spencer, the one who had uncovered crucial documents, gave a little toast about standing up for each other. She smiled at me, saying, "This gate used to be a symbol of everything she hated. Now it's a symbol of our freedom to live without fear." The crowd applauded. Someone clinked 2 soda cans together. Children giggled. It was a far cry from the tension-filled nights when we feared more attacks. A couple people asked if I regretted what happened to her SUV, given how dramatic it all was. My honest answer? I regretted that she'd put me in a position where I had to protect my property so forcefully, but in that moment, with her ignoring warnings and continuing to cause destruction, I had no alternative. The footage clearly showed that she refused to stop, and the resulting chaos was on her. The event taught me that, sometimes, you stand your ground to save what you hold dear. Months later, I was repairing a section of fencing along the road when a black car I didn't recognize slowed to a stop. A man in a suit rolled down the window, gazed at the gate, shook his head as though recalling the fiasco, then drove on. I wondered if he was from that same real estate group, still scouting the area. But I felt confident they'd realize we were united now. Pushing us around wouldn't be so easy. Strength in numbers is a powerful thing. The last time I heard anything about Mrs. McGill, it came from one of her old friends who mentioned she'd moved 2 counties away and was living quietly, off the radar. Whether she'd learned any lesson from this debacle, I couldn't say. Perhaps she'd try to start over, hopefully without repeating the same controlling behaviors. As for our town, the HOA restructured, installed a new president, a calm and reasonable woman named Paula, and they revised their charter to clarify boundaries regarding older properties like mine. The newly adopted guidelines emphasize collaboration rather than top-down enforcement. Today, when visitors drive in, they can't miss that big red gate. I've joked about adding a plaque that reads, "Where HOA tyranny came to a grinding end," complete with a tiny metal sculpture of a crushed SUV under a tractor's bucket. That might be a bit excessive, but sometimes I chuckle envisioning it. The more important takeaway is that we've regained a sense of peace and mutual respect. People learned they had a voice, especially when they joined forces against intimidation. Reflecting on everything, I can still remember the metallic crunch as my tractor's steel bucket tore through her hood. It wasn't a moment of glory, just a final straw that stopped her from flattening what remained of my gate. Part of me wishes she'd never gone to that extreme. Part of me is relieved we had the means to defend our home. Either way, the outcome stands as a testament that no bully stays invincible forever. If there's a lesson to glean, it's this. Our individuality or unique way of painting a gate or planting a garden should never be snuffed out by the desires of a single authoritarian personality. Uniformity is fine for certain things, but it should never crush diversity of thought, expression, or tradition. My father taught me that this ranch was our safe haven, a place to flourish in our own style. Nobody has the right to storm in at dawn, demanding we erase our family legacy for the sake of a color palette. Sometimes, you have to dig in your heels, brace yourself, and say no to intimidation. We nearly lost that gate. We almost let her unstoppable wave of fabricated citations bury us. But enough was enough. That battered old tractor, a symbol of my grandfather's resilience, made it clear that lines had been crossed. And in the end, a community that was once frightened found its courage and spoke out against the tyranny that threatened to ruin our homes. So, there you have it. The cautionary tale of how one HOA president lost every shred of power she once held. She came onto my property at the break of dawn, certain she could demolish a gate and drive me off the land. She brought heavy equipment, an SUV, and a vengeful attitude. But a determined rancher, a loyal group of neighbors, and one unstoppable tractor put a swift end to her scheme. It cost her her vehicle, her reputation, and possibly her freedom, though that was a consequence of her own reckless arrogance, not anyone else's place. Sometimes, people ask me if I'd do anything differently. I usually answer that I wish we'd settled it through civil conversation long ago. Perhaps if she'd recognized early on that ranch life doesn't adhere to the same aesthetic guidelines as a cookie-cutter suburb, we could have avoided the entire spectacle. Yet her obsession made that impossible. In a strange way, the conflict united the neighborhood more than any HOA rulebook ever could. We discovered our collective strength, which might be the best silver lining to an otherwise disastrous episode. Now, each day when I roll out of bed and see sunlight glinting off that bright red gate, I'm reminded of how important it is to protect what's yours. It's not about defying every regulation, It's about standing up when something's genuinely wrong. The ranch has stood here for generations, and with a community now awake to how easily we can be manipulated, if we stay silent, it'll stand for many more. And if another petty tyrant tries to impose their will, they'd better think twice. We've proven how unstoppable a tractor can be against an unjust blockadier, an SUV belonging to a would-be dictator. The last phrase I want to share is this: never underestimate your ability to fight back, even if all you've got is some old farm equipment, a defiant coat of paint, and a few good neighbors. Sometimes those simple things are enough to topple someone who believes their power is absolute. Mrs. McGill learned that lesson the hard way. Let it be a warning to anyone else who tries the same heavy-handed tactics. A red gate, a determined rancher, and a bit of stubborn pride can accomplish more than you'd ever expect, especially once that tractor shifts into gear. As the weeks unfolded, the ranch settled into a rhythm that felt almost surreal compared to the crazed days of HOA tyranny. Mornings began with the familiar crow of a rooster rather than the screech of a siren. Sunlight poured over rolling pastures where cattle grazed peacefully, and I found myself lingering in the barn a little longer, enjoying the simple tasks of brushing down horses and filling grain troughs. Each barn door I closed felt like a barrier against the memory of that pre-dawn confrontation, when all I wanted was to preserve my heritage and ended up facing down a furious HOA president with an old tractor. Neighbors trickled by more often than before. Some simply waved from passing trucks. Others lingered for a few minutes, asking if I needed a hand repairing the fence where her bulldozer had scraped the post anchors. A surprising number asked for fresh eggs. Even folks who had never spoken to me, intimidated by Mrs. McGill's relentless grip, began stopping by once they realized the HOA's power had crumbled. I'd offer them a half-dozen farm-fresh eggs at cost, but most insisted on paying a bit more as a gesture of solidarity. Over time, I realized those small exchanges of kindness had a ripple effect. They proved that, in the end, community wasn't built on uniform beige gates and petty fines, but on genuine acts of mutual support. Every sunset painted the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, reminders of the vibrant life beyond rigid regulations. One evening, I stood on my porch leaning against the worn railing, watching as my neighbor Carla's children rode their bicycles down the adjacent gravel road, laughter echoing across the fields. Carla herself waved at me from her driveway, a broad grin on her face. She jogged over, carrying a plate of freshly baked biscuits. "I thought you might be hungry after wrangling that old tractor this morning," she said, placing the warm biscuits on the table beside my rocking chair. That small gesture, so out of place in a community once ruled by fear, underscored how far we'd come since Mrs. McGill's downfall. In those moments, I occasionally reflected on how anger and fear had once consumed me. The first few nights after she crushed my gate, sleep came fitfully. Every creak of the porch at dusk made me jolt upright, heart pounding. I would replay the crushing metal echoing under my tractor's bucket, turn over scenarios of how the law might turn against me, and imagine her slinking away victorious. But as the days passed without any legal repercussions confirmed by the sheriff's department, I realized the nightmare had truly ended. The bulldoze gate and the flattened SUV were not just symbols of destruction, they were, ultimately, symbols of a turning tide. Once she had crossed that final line and answered to the law, the illusion of her omnipotence evaporated. The court case dragged on for a few more months, with Mrs. McGill's defense lawyers arguing technicalities about HOA authority. She tried insisting that her role as president granted her extraordinary latitude to define aesthetic standards, however she saw fit, but no judge would buy that interpretation. Under questioning, it became painfully clear that the forged documents, the staged citations, and the secret communication with a development firm made her actions indefensible. She pleaded no contest to the major charge: trespassing, vandalism, obstruction of justice, and slipped into court-mandated therapy and community service. The final hearing ended with probation, restitution payments toward the HOA's legal fees, and a prohibition on holding any HOA office or influencing its operations. I attended the final judgment, sitting in a back row with my attorney, flanked by a handful of courageous neighbors who had testified on my behalf. Mrs. McGill shuffled in, head bowed, her pastel hair dulled under fluorescent courthouse lights. As the judge's gavel fell, pronouncing her sentence, I watched her lips tremble in a cascade of remorse and denial. Her eyes flicked toward me, widening in recognition of her own downfall. Afterward, she lingered to plead for leniency, promising to drive east and start a new chapter away from Willow Creek County. I didn't say a word. Justice had been served. No extra harshness was necessary. Once the court proceedings wrapped, the community wasted no time in repairing the HOA's image. At the next HOA meeting, chaired by the newly elected president, Paula Ramirez, residents, including older families who'd once lived outside the original subdivision, proposed amendments to the bylaws emphasizing fairness. The board unanimously passed a resolution protecting any property that existed prior to the HOA's formation from arbitrary aesthetic rules. They also established a community council with rotating membership, including representatives like me, to ensure no single voice could again wield such unchecked authority. The meeting concluded with applause, not for any one individual, but for the collective spirit that refused to be subdued. Life returned to a comfortable normality. On lazy Saturday mornings, kids from the development banged on my back gate, pleading for hayrides and horse petting. I took them into the pasture, showing them how to gently scratch a horse's withers, explain safety around livestock, and encourage quiet observation. Over time, several parents asked me to teach basic horsemanship classes. I began offering weekly sessions, bringing me back to my roots, to a time when I had learned these skills on my grandfather's knee. Teaching those classes, I still felt the echo of past tension, but it transformed into a sense of responsibility, preserving not just a ranch, but a way of life. Spring arrived with a riot of green. New grass sprouted, wildflowers dotted the pasture, and the windmill blades turned with renewed vigor. One morning, I gathered up enough eggs to fill a dozen baskets, each tied with raffia and a note, from the King Ranch gratitude for standing together. I delivered them across the neighborhood, meeting neighbors at their doors, a young couple who'd once cowered when Mrs. McGill snapped her fingers at them, an elderly man who'd lost his prized rose bushes to fines, even a skeptical family who'd never shown up to testify until the final hearing. Their smiles, tears, and gruff thank yous made the small gesture feel monumental. In those exchanges, I sensed we'd all found a sense of belonging that transcended property lines. At dusk one evening, I closed up the barn and walked to the edge of the driveway, where the red gate stood proud against the cobalt sky. Its rich hue glowed in the fading light, a beacon of defiance and hope. I'd carved a small metal plaque at its corner. "In unity, we stand strong," followed by King Ranch Est, 1960. That phrase encapsulated everything: the resilience of a ranch family, the solidarity of neighbors, and the truth that some battles, however fierce, can strengthen rather than tear apart. I turned and walked inside, pausing at the threshold to glance at my grandfather's old rocking chair resting by the fireplace. His worn cowboy hat still hung from a peg by the barn door, a silent witness to all that had come to pass. I pulled the hat down, settled into the chair, and thought back to his gruff voice telling me, "Son, never let fear keep you from protecting what's yours." I'd heeded that lesson, albeit in a more dramatic way than either of us might have imagined. Later that week, an invitation arrived from the local community college. They wanted to feature me in a seminar about rural community resilience, alongside other area leaders. I hesitated, wondering if public speaking was truly my calling. But then I considered the ironic twist. A rancher who once shunned the limelight now had a story that could encourage others to stand up against injustice. So, I said yes. As I prepared, I scribbled notes about my experience, how a sense of place can galvanize a community, how shared adversity can forge unexpected bonds, and how, in the end, an old tractor could symbolize both heritage and hope. On the day of the seminar, I stood at the podium before an audience of students, activists, and local officials. I recounted the tale of the Red Gate, the forged citations, and the final showdown when my tractor crushed Mrs. McGill's SUV. There were a few gasps and uneasy chuckles when I described that crunch of metal, but overall, the room listened intently. I emphasized that no piece of land, no matter how small, should be controlled by a single person's whims. I spoke about the need for transparent governance and accessible channels for residents to voice concerns. When I finished, the applause was generous, not because of my own courage, but because of the shared belief that communities thrive only when people refuse to be silenced. Returning home that evening, I drove through the neighborhood under a navy sky dotted with stars. Houses glowed warmly, smoke rose from chimneys, and somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. The ranch gate gleamed softly under the moonlight, a sentinel watching over fields, horses, and a still-standing home. I parked my truck and walked up to it, brushing my hand over the smooth red planks as if greeting an old friend. I whispered a quiet promise. As long as I draw breath, this gate will stand, and so will everything it represents.